The man's name was Harlan Butte, and he had a voice like gravel dragged across sheet iron. He stepped into the doorway of the Raven Creek Cookhouse on a Tuesday morning in January, while 12 ranch hands sat at the long table waiting for breakfast, and he said it loud enough for every one of them to hear. "Foreman sent us a cook, boys. Sent us a whole lot of cook." Laughter broke across the table. Not all of it, maybe half. But the half that laughed did so without hesitation, and that was the sound Evelyn Hartwell had been hearing her entire life. She was standing 6 feet behind him, holding a cast-iron skillet in one hand and a full pot of coffee in the other, and she did not set either one down. She looked at the back of Harlan's head. She looked at the men at the table. Some of them were already embarrassed, staring at their plates. Others were still smiling, waiting to see what she'd do. She walked forward. Harlan didn't move. She walked forward anyway, and when the edge of the coffee pot pressed against his shoulder blade, she said very quietly, "You're standing in my kitchen." If you've ever been laughed at before you opened your mouth, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the weight of other people's assumptions settle on you before you said a single word, then you already know what Evelyn was carrying when she stepped through that door. And you're probably asking yourself the same thing she asked herself every morning for 34 years. How long do you keep proving yourself to people who've already made up their minds? Subscribe to this channel. Follow this story to the end. Because what happens next between Evelyn Hartwell and the quiet man at the middle of that table is the kind of thing that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about who holds the power in a room. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Evelyn had not come to Raven Creek Ranch because she wanted to. She had come because the letter arrived on a Thursday, the same week her previous employer in Billings decided he no longer needed a cook of her particular build managing his dining room. He'd used those exact words, particular build, and handed her a month's wages and a recommendation letter so vague it was nearly useless. She was 34 years old. She had been cooking since she was 11. She could manage a fire, a failing stove, 3 courses, and a difficult man simultaneously, and she had done it in hotel kitchens, in mining camp tents, and in the back of a chuck wagon rolling across the Missouri breaks. She knew food the way some people knew music, by feel, by instinct, by the particular sound a good braise made when it was almost ready. None of that had ever made her thin. None of it had ever made people stop staring. The letter from Raven Creek was brief. A cattle operation outside of a small settlement called Decker Hollow, Montana. 12 workers. Hard winter. Previous cook had quit after 3 weeks without explanation. The foreman, a man named George Aldine, was offering $30 a month, room and board, and what he described as a functional kitchen with adequate supplies. Evelyn read that phrase, though, adequate supplies, though, and immediately translated it to mean barely enough, poorly organized, and probably in need of serious work. She took the job. The wagon that brought her from Decker Hollow to the ranch had no roof, and by the time it stopped in front of the main building, snow had settled across her coat in a thin white layer that made her look, as one of the hands later told her, like a cold mountain. She'd been too tired to find that funny at the time. Later, she thought it was probably accurate. George Aldine had met her at the door with a handshake and the expression of a man who had expected someone else. He covered it quickly, but not quickly enough. He showed her the kitchen. It was large, which was good. The stove had a cracked plate on the left burner, which was bad. The supply pantry had flour, salt pork, dried beans, a sack of cornmeal that was halfway to going rancid, and 3 cases of canned tomatoes that someone had stacked in a corner and apparently forgotten about. She stood in the doorway of that pantry for a long moment. "When do they eat?" she asked. 6 in the morning, noon, and 7 at night, Aldine said. "I'll need lard. Real lard, not drippings. And I'll need it by tomorrow morning. I can send someone to town in the... Tonight," she said. "I'll make do with what's here for supper, but I need proper supplies before breakfast, or those men will be working half strength by mid-morning. You hired me to keep 12 workers fed through a hard winter. I can do that. But I need the materials." Aldine looked at her for a moment in a way she recognized, recalibrating, adjusting his assessment without quite admitting he'd had one. Then he nodded and went to find someone to make the supply run. That was the first evening. Evelyn had been there for approximately 40 minutes. She didn't unpack her bag before she started on supper. There wasn't time. She assessed the stove, determined the cracked plate was workable. If she kept the heat lower on that side, found a set of decent cast iron pans hanging on a wall hook, and started on a bean and salt pork stew that would stretch what she had into something that could actually feed 12 hungry men without tasting like an apology. They came in at 7. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on the porch, the scrape of chairs, voices that dropped only slightly when they entered the cookhouse. Then Harlan Butte was in the doorway, and she already knew the shape of the moment before it happened. She'd been in enough kitchens. She'd heard enough variations of that particular kind of laughter. It was never creative and it was never clever, but it still landed the same way every time, like a hand pressing down on your shoulder to remind you of your place. She pressed the coffee pot to Harlan's shoulder blade. He moved. Not fast and not gracefully, but he moved. He stepped to the side and she walked past him to the table and began filling cups without looking at anyone. The laughter from a moment ago had gone quiet. She set the pot down at the end of the table, went back to the stove, and started bringing out the food. No one said anything for a while. The stew was good. It was more than good. It was exactly what those men needed after a day in the kind of cold that made everything ache, and they ate in the way hungry people eat when they're surprised by something, which is quietly and quickly and with a certain grudging attention. She heard one of them, a younger man with a patchy beard sitting near the window, say to the man next to him, "That's better than what Davies made." Davies, she assumed, was the previous cook. She didn't acknowledge it. She was at the stove, keeping the pot warm for seconds, watching the table without appearing to. There was a man in the middle of the table who she noticed only because he was the one she didn't notice at first. That sounds contradictory. It wasn't. The other men had presence in a physical way. They took up space, they talked, they moved with the particular loudness of men who worked hard and knew it. This one sat at the middle of the long table, not at either end where you'd expect a foreman or a senior hand to sit, and he ate with the focused attention of someone who was actually tasting the food rather than simply consuming it. He was not especially tall, not especially broad. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had spent considerable time outdoors without getting dramatic about it. When he finished his bowl, he set his spoon down carefully and looked up. His eyes found her for just a moment. She was certain they found her, not the stove or the wall behind her. And then he looked back down at the table. He did not say anything. He did not nod. He just looked and then stopped looking. She thought, ranch hand, quiet type. Probably been here a few winters. She thought no more about him that night. By the 4th day, Evelyn had reorganized the supply pantry twice, identified the cracked stoveplate as more serious than she'd originally assessed, submitted a written list of required repairs to George Aldine, and begun the process of making the kitchen actually functional as opposed to theoretically functional. The cold was a different kind of enemy than she'd dealt with before. In Billings, cold was an inconvenience. At Raven Creek, it was a participant. It found gaps in the building she hadn't known were there. It turned the walk to the supply shed into a small ordeal. It meant that the fire in the stove had to be maintained with genuine attention because if it went out in the night, nothing would be warm by morning, and cold food could not sustain men doing the kind of physical labor those ranch hands were doing. She slept with one ear open. She was not constitutionally a light sleeper, but she had learned over years of managing kitchens in isolated places to develop that particular awareness, the one that woke you when the building went too quiet and too cold simultaneously. It had never been part of anyone's job description. It was just the kind of thing that fell to the person who understood the kitchen as something more than a room. On the 5th morning, Harlan Butte was in the kitchen before she was. He was not there to cause trouble. He was standing next to the stove with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that he'd clearly filled himself from yesterday's pot, which meant he was drinking cold, day-old coffee, and the expression on his face suggested he was aware this was what he deserved. "Stove's still burning," he said when she came in. "I banked it before I went to bed," she said. He nodded. A short, uncomfortable nod. Then, "The beans last night were good." She looked at him. "I'm saying they were good," he repeated, as if she might have misunderstood. "The beans." "I heard you." She went to the stove and began checking the fire, not because it needed checking so much as because it gave her something to do with her hands, while she processed the fact that Harlan Butte was standing in her kitchen at 5 in the morning, complimenting her cooking. The man who 4 days ago had used her body as a punchline in front of 12 people. "What do you want?" she asked. Not rudely, directly. He shifted his weight. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of strength that came from actual physical work, and he looked at this particular moment genuinely uncertain of himself. "I was out of line the other day," he said, "when you came in." She turned around. She looked at him fully, which she had not done since that first morning. He was older than she'd initially registered, somewhere in his 40s, with the particular worn-in quality of a man who had not had an easy life. He wasn't meeting her eyes directly, which told her this was not practiced. He wasn't good at this. "I know you were," she said. He stopped, started again. "It was a bad habit, saying stupid things before I think." "Most habits are," she said. Then, "Sit down. I'll make fresh coffee." He sat. She made coffee. They did not have a conversation exactly. She was working, and he was watching her work with the slightly dazed attention of a man who wasn't sure how he'd ended up here. But by the time the coffee was ready and the other men began filtering in, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not friendship, just the particular acknowledgement between two adults that a thing had happened, the wrong person had been wrong about it, and now there was a different arrangement. It was not a perfect resolution. She didn't trust Harlan Butte. But she understood him, which was different and sometimes more useful. The quiet man's name she learned from the youngest hand, a 19-year-old named Cody, who talked with the enthusiasm of someone who had not yet learned that silence was an option, was Nathaniel Cross. "Been here longer than anyone," Cody told her one afternoon while she was teaching him to properly peel a potato, which he was doing badly. "Don't say much, but he's always right when he does say something. George listens to him." "George listens to a ranch hand?" she asked. Cody shrugged. He's not exactly a regular hand. He just kind of does whatever needs doing. You'd never know he was, he stopped. "You'd never know he was what?" she asked. Cody concentrated very hard on his potato. "Just saying he's not like the rest of us. He pays attention different." She let it go. She had work to do, and an incomplete sentence from a 19-year-old was not a mystery she needed to solve. But she did start paying attention to Nathaniel Cross in the way you start noticing something once someone has pointed at it, even obliquely. He did work with the crew. She'd see him through the kitchen window, repairing fence line in the morning, carrying hay in the afternoon, helping wrestle a panicked steer back toward the barn in weather that made the task look genuinely dangerous. He didn't manage the crew. He worked alongside them, and in the evenings, at the table, he sat in the middle and ate what was left. That detail bothered her more than she wanted to admit. In every kitchen she'd ever run, she knew who ate first by watching who waited. The men who ate first were the ones who believed they'd earned priority, by rank, by authority, or simply by the assumption that they deserved to go before others. The ones who ate last were either the most selfless or the most uncertain of their standing. Nathaniel Cross didn't eat last because he was timid. She could see that much. He ate last because he had decided that's how things should go, and that decision appeared to have cost him nothing emotionally. He was not performing sacrifice. He simply ate last the way some men simply hung up their coats, without making anything of it. She started keeping a plate warm for him. She didn't announce this. She just made sure that when the end of supper came and Nathaniel Cross's turn came, the food on his plate was the same temperature as it had been for the first man at the table. He noticed. She saw that he noticed. He looked at the plate, and then at her, and then, very briefly, he said, "Thank you." 2 words. That was all. But something in the way he said it suggested he understood what the gesture meant, which was not "here is your food," but rather "you also matter in this room," and that he was not accustomed to being told that by someone who didn't already know who he was. The blizzard came on a Wednesday. George Aldine had been watching the sky since Monday, and when the temperature dropped 12 degrees in 6 hours on Tuesday night, he'd come to find her and said, in the way of frontier men who delivered bad news practically, "We may be pinned down for 4 or 5 days. You need to account for that." She was already accounting for it. She'd spent Tuesday afternoon reorganizing the pantry for a siege, pulling forward the heaviest stores, rationing mentally, calculating what she could stretch and what she could not. She had Cody haul extra firewood to the kitchen building until there was a stack against the interior wall tall enough to last 3 days without a resupply run. She prepared 3 batches of bread dough and set them in the cold room at the back of the building where they'd slow rise rather than freeze, which meant she could bake 2 days' worth of bread from work she'd already done. She was 45 minutes into Wednesday morning when she heard the storm hit the building. It was not a sound so much as a pressure. The entire structure seemed to tighten against something enormous pressing from outside. And then the wind found the gaps she'd identified in her first week, and the temperature in the kitchen dropped 4 degrees in 15 minutes. She added fuel to the stove. The pipes in the wall, old iron pipes that carried water from the pump, groaned in a way she didn't like. She kept working. By mid-morning, the kitchen pipes were making a sound she'd heard once before in a mining camp in Wyoming, which was the sound of water slowing inside iron walls just before it stopped moving. She knew what came next. The water stopped, the ice expanded, and old pipes cracked. She went to find Aldine. Aldine was not available. He was dealing with a situation in the barn that apparently involved 3 frightened horses and a section of roof. She went to find the only other person who seemed to be always where he was supposed to be. Nathaniel Cross was in the bunkhouse, sitting at a small table, mending a piece of harness leather with the focused economy of a man who didn't waste effort. He looked up when she came in. "The kitchen pipes are going to freeze," she said. "If they burst, I lose water pressure and possibly the pipes themselves. I don't have the tools to address this alone, and there isn't time to wait for Aldine." He stood up immediately. He didn't ask questions. He picked up his coat from the hook beside his bunk, and he said, "Show me." That was all. "Show me." She showed him. What followed was not elegant. It was 2 people in a cold kitchen working on a problem that was getting worse faster than they could address it, which meant improvising, wrapping pipe sections in whatever cloth she could spare, holding heat lamps close to the wall junctions while the other person monitored the pressure, making decisions quickly and sometimes incorrectly, and then correcting. At one point, she suggested wrapping a section of pipe with a piece of canvas she'd been using as a work surface, and he told her without ceremony that the canvas would not hold heat well enough and asked if she had anything wool-based. She thought about it, went to her room, and came back with a spare blanket that she handed him without saying anything. He wrapped the pipe. She held the lamp. The pipes did not freeze. By the time Aldine appeared at the kitchen door 3 hours later to check on the situation, she and Nathaniel were drinking coffee at the kitchen table in the particular exhausted quiet of 2 people who had just solved something difficult together. Aldine looked at the wrapped pipes. He looked at the 2 of them. He said, "Good," and went back out. Evelyn looked at Nathaniel over her coffee cup. "You've done that before," she said. "Pipe work? Some. Specifically that, assessing quickly, not overcomplicating. You've managed things under pressure." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not defensive, not proud. Something in between, like he was deciding how much of an answer to give. "I've run operations in difficult conditions," he said. "Different circumstances, similar problems." She waited for more. He didn't offer more. She filed it away. There were 12 men at Raven Creek Ranch, and over 6 weeks Evelyn had learned something meaningful about each of them. Not by asking, but by paying attention. Harlan Butte was rough on the outside and genuinely sorry about it. He needed to be the first one to apologize, and he needed it acknowledged without ceremony. Cody was 19 and terrified of being 19, which meant he talked too much and worked too hard and needed to occasionally be told he was doing fine. There was a man named Petit who was 37 and had a wife and 2 children in Bozeman and kept their photograph in his shirt pocket and looked at it when he thought no one was watching. There was a man named Swenson who had an injury in his left knee that he refused to mention and that she'd identified by watching the way he sat down, always at an angle, always with the same slight delay. She remembered all of them. She remembered their preferences at the table, which she'd learned without asking. Petit didn't like the taste of salt pork, so she gave him extra beans. Swenson's knee responded badly to cold mornings, so she always had something hot ready before the others woke. She knew who had bad nights and who woke up difficult, and who needed a moment before they could function in the morning. She knew who would do an extra task if asked directly, and who needed to be allowed to volunteer. She knew who was proud and who was embarrassed, and what the difference looked like. She learned all of this because she cooked for them, and cooking for people, when you did it seriously, meant paying attention to what they actually needed rather than what was easiest to provide. She'd been doing this her whole life, and she'd never thought of it as anything other than the job. But she was beginning to understand somewhere around week 6 that most people did not think of it this way. Most people thought of cooking as a task. She thought of it as a kind of attention. Nathaniel watched her the way she watched the crew. She noticed this around week 4, and it bothered her in a way she couldn't immediately explain. Not the watching itself, she was used to being observed, and not always charitably. It was the quality of the attention. Harlan watched her occasionally to see if she'd slip up. Cody watched her because he found everything interesting. Some of the others watched her in the distracted way of men who were thinking about something else entirely. Nathaniel watched her the way she watched the crew, with the specific focus of someone cataloging information for a reason. She didn't ask him why. She wasn't ready to ask that question yet, because she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. What she knew was this: Nathaniel Cross worked hard, said little, ate last, and had helped her save the kitchen pipes on a Wednesday during a blizzard without being asked, and without making anything of it afterward. He treated her like someone whose time and effort mattered. He didn't comment on her appearance. He didn't make her invisible. He didn't offer the particular brand of courtesy that was actually condescension wearing a polite face. He just treated her like a person doing a job that mattered, which was something she had spent 34 years working for and found, in most places, in short supply. It was possible, she thought one night, doing the last of the washing up with the wind still hammering the building, that Nathaniel Cross was simply a decent man. The world had enough indecent ones that she'd stopped expecting decency as a default, and so when she encountered it, she kept waiting for it to prove itself false. He hadn't proven it false yet. She didn't know what to do with that, so she put it aside and went to bed and woke up at 5 the next morning and made breakfast for 12 people, one of whom would eat last, and one of whom would eat what she'd kept warm for him. It was Cody who mentioned the birthday. He said it in passing. Old Pettit's birthday's next week, not that anyone will remember, while carrying firewood, and he said it with the particular casualness of someone who wanted someone else to pick up the thread without having to be the one to do something about it himself. She picked up the thread. She didn't have the materials for a cake exactly, but she had dried fruit she'd been rationing, and she had enough sugar, and she had the basic components of something that, with effort and creativity, could honor the intention if not the ideal. She spent 2 hours on the morning of Petit's birthday. She'd looked it up in the ranch ledger, where Aldine kept basic crew records, making something between a cake and a bread pudding that used the dried fruit and a careful measure of the rationed sugar and came out of the oven smelling genuinely good. She set it at the end of the supper table that evening with no ceremony, just set it there. Petit walked in and stopped. He said, "What's that?" "Dessert," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the cake. His face went through several things quickly, and then it settled into the particular expression of a man who was not going to cry in front of 11 other men, which meant he held very still and nodded and said, "Well," and sat down. She saw Nathaniel Cross watch this from across the table. He looked at the cake, and then at Petit, and then at her. And the expression on his face was not surprise exactly. It was something slower and more considered, like he was adding something to a calculation he'd been running for a while. Later, when the others had gone and she was cleaning up, Nathaniel was still at the table. He did this sometimes, sat at the table after supper doing nothing in particular, which she'd initially found strange and had gradually come to accept as simply a thing he did. "He has children in Bozeman," she said, not looking up from the dishes. "He looks at their photograph every day. He hasn't seen them since September." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. Then, "How do you know all of this?" She did look up then. "Because I pay attention," she said. "Because when you cook for someone, you're not just cooking. You're responsible for how they feel when they leave that table, whether they feel seen or invisible, whether they feel like they matter in that room. That's the job." He looked at her for a long time, not unsettling, just genuinely attentive, in the way she was beginning to recognize as his particular mode of engagement. "Most people don't think about it that way," he said. "Most people don't cook seriously," she replied. She went back to the dishes. He was quiet. "It was a good thing you did," he said finally, meaning the birthday. She nodded. She didn't say thank you, and she didn't say it was nothing, because neither was quite right. She'd done it because it needed doing, and she was the one who could do it. That was all. That was the whole thing. But she noted, filed carefully and quietly, in the part of her mind where she kept the things she wasn't ready to examine directly, that Nathaniel Cross had understood why she'd done it without requiring an explanation. That was not nothing. The week after Petit's birthday, the temperature dropped again. It dropped the way it did in Montana in late January. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like something heavy being set down. Evelyn woke at 4:30 that morning to a kitchen that had lost 10 degrees overnight despite the banked fire, and she knew before she was fully awake that the day was going to require more from her than the day before. This was the nature of winter at Raven Creek. Every time she thought she had the rhythm of the place figured out, the weather adjusted the terms. She rebuilt the fire. She checked the pipes, still intact, still moving, the wool wrapping from the blizzard week still in place, because she'd left it there on the theory that it couldn't hurt. She started the oatmeal and the coffee and the salt pork and the biscuits, and by the time the first men began filtering in from the bunkhouse at 5:50, stamping snow from their boots and blowing on their hands, the cookhouse was warm and smelled like something worth getting out of bed for. Harlan Butte came in third. He stopped inside the door the way he'd been stopping inside the door lately, deliberately, like a man making a conscious choice about how to enter a room, and he nodded at her before taking his seat. She nodded back. This was their arrangement now, unspoken and unformalized, but real. He caused her no more trouble. In return, she made no reference to the trouble he'd caused. It was not warmth exactly, but it was functional, which was more than she'd expected from him in the first week. Cody sat down next to Swenson and immediately began talking about something he'd heard from the supply driver the previous week. A rumor about a land purchase somewhere north of Decker Hollow, some company moving in, buying up grazing rights. Swenson listened with the patient expression of a man who had learned that Cody talking was simply weather. You waited for it to pass. Nathaniel Cross came in last. He always came in last, or close to it. Not because he was slow. She'd watched him work, and he was efficient in every physical task she'd observed, but because he seemed to operate on a timeline that was slightly offset from everyone else's, as if he was always coming from somewhere the others hadn't been. He sat in his usual place, in the middle of the long table, and he poured his own coffee from the pot she kept there, and he ate what she brought him with the same focused attention he always brought to food, which she had come to understand was not indifference, but rather genuine appreciation that didn't feel the need to announce itself. She watched him for a moment from across the kitchen. Then she brought out the biscuits and stopped watching, because there was work to do. The morning passed the way mornings passed at Raven Creek, in the accumulated small urgencies of a working ranch in winter. By 7, the men were gone to their various tasks, and she was alone in the kitchen doing the breakfast cleanup and starting the preliminary work for noon. She had a routine now, a solid one, the kind that had taken 2 weeks of adjustment to establish, and that she protected fiercely because routine in a place like this was not comfort, it was survival infrastructure. If she fell behind in the morning, she was behind all day, and a cook who fell behind at a 12-man working ranch in a Montana winter was not just an inconvenience. She was a problem. She was elbow-deep in bread dough when George Aldine appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, which was unusual for Aldine, who was a man who generally came through doors already talking. She looked up. "Something wrong with the bread?" she asked. "No." He came in and sat down at the near end of the table, which was also unusual. Aldine did not typically sit in the kitchen during working hours. "I wanted to ask you something." She kept working the dough. "Ask." "You've been here 7 weeks now," he said. 8 as of Thursday." 8 weeks." He paused. "Are you staying?" She looked up again. He was watching her with an expression that was difficult to categorize. It wasn't pressure exactly, and it wasn't concern exactly, but it had elements of both. "I was hired through spring," she said. "I assumed that was the arrangement." "It was." "It is." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm asking because there's a situation developing that may affect the ranch's operations. And I want to know whether the cook I've got is planning to be here when it matters." She set the dough aside and wiped her hands on her apron. "What situation?" Aldine looked at the door, checked it was closed, and then looked back at her. "There's a company operating out of Helena. They've been buying up land in this valley for 2 years. Grazing rights, water access, acreage. They move quiet, they move legal, and by the time most ranchers understand what's happened, there's a contract with their name on it that makes the land effectively theirs, in function, even if not in title." She waited. "Raven Creek has water," he said. "We have 2 year-round streams on the property and access rights to the third one east of the fence line. That makes us valuable to people who want control of what the valley can support." And these people are moving on Raven Creek? Aldine said, They're trying to. Then what does that have to do with whether I stay? He looked at her steadily. Because what's coming isn't just a business problem. It's going to affect every man on this property. And the center of this ranch, the place where they eat, where they talk, where they feel like there's something here worth defending, is your kitchen. He paused. I've been running cattle operations for 20 years, Miss Hartwell. I know what a cook is, and I know what you are, and those are not the same thing. What you are is the reason 12 men got up this morning and went to work in that cold without complaining. I need to know you'll be here. She looked at him for a long time. I'll be here, she said. She picked the dough back up. Aldine nodded, stood, and went back out into the cold without further ceremony. She listened to his boots on the porch and thought about what he'd told her. The company in Helena, the water rights, the quiet movement of legal machinery designed to take things from people before they understood what was being taken. She'd seen that kind of thing before, in different forms. She'd cooked in places where the men she fed went home one day to find something that had been theirs was no longer theirs, transferred through contracts they hadn't fully understood, enforced by people with resources they couldn't match. The particular helplessness of that, not violence, not confrontation, but the slow legal erasure of what you'd built, was something she understood in her bones. She worked the bread dough harder than it strictly required. She didn't mention what Aldine had told her to any of the men. It wasn't her information to share, and she didn't know enough of the details to share it responsibly. But she paid different attention to the dinner table that evening, watched the faces, listened to the conversations, noticed what the men talked about when they weren't talking about work. Cody brought up the land company again, the one he'd heard about from the supply driver. He repeated the rumor with some additional embellishment this time. The company was apparently buying up the water rights specifically, not the land itself, which was a more sophisticated approach than simple purchase. Swenson told him to stop listening to supply drivers. Harlan said he'd heard something similar from a man in town 2 weeks ago and had thought nothing of it. Nathaniel Cross, sitting in his usual place, said nothing. Evelyn watched him not say anything. He wasn't absent from the conversation the way a disinterested man was absent. He was present in the focused, contained way she'd come to recognize as his particular form of engagement. He was listening to every word. His eyes moved across the table, tracking speakers. Once, briefly, he looked at her, and she thought she saw something in his expression that was not quite warning and not quite reassurance, but was somewhere in that territory. Then he looked back at his food. After supper, she kept back to clean up as always. The men filed out into the cold. Nathaniel stayed at the table longer than usual, turning his coffee cup in his hands. You heard about the company, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked up. What company? The one Cody was talking. The Helena operation buying water rights in the valley. A pause. I've heard of it. She looked at him directly. Aldine told me this morning that Raven Creek is a target, that the water on this property makes it valuable to people who want to control what the valley can support. Nathaniel set his coffee cup down. Did he? He said. He did. She leaned against the counter. He asked me whether I was planning to stay. He said what's coming will affect everyone on this property. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table and then at the wall, and then, with the particular deliberateness of a man who is choosing something rather than defaulting to it, he looked at her. What did you tell him? He asked. I told him I'd be here, she said. I gave him my word, and I meant it, but I want to know what I'm giving my word to. She paused. What's actually happening with this land? He looked at her. The look lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, but she held it. It's being managed, he said finally. The situation with the company. It won't resolve quickly, but it won't be allowed to go the wrong direction. Who's managing it? Another pause. Something moved across his face. Not evasion exactly, but a careful repositioning, like a man shifting weight on uncertain ground. People withstanding to address it, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. That's not an answer, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. He stood, picked up his coat from the hook beside the door, and went out. She listened to his footsteps on the porch, heavier than usual, moving in the direction of the barn rather than the bunkhouse. She stood at the counter for a long moment, staring at the space where he'd been sitting. People withstanding to address it. She didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she always did when something sat wrong with her. She went back to work. She had bread to finish, supplies to inventory, and 12 men who needed feeding in the morning. The mysterious operations of Nathaniel Cross could wait until she had a better angle on them. February arrived and brought with it a week of relative warmth. Relative meaning the temperature climbed above zero during the day and only dropped to 15 or so at night, which after the previous weeks felt almost generous. The snow compacted and hardened rather than continuing to accumulate, and the men's moods lifted correspondingly. Even Swenson, who maintained a baseline expression of deep weather-related grievance, looked marginally less aggrieved. Evelyn used the slightly easier week to address things she'd been deferring, deep cleaning the pantry, making a proper inventory of what they had and what they'd need to order before March, assessing the stove situation with fresh eyes. The cracked burner plate had held, but it was getting worse. She wrote it up in a report to Aldine and submitted it with the week's supply order, noting that a replacement plate would cost less than the stove if the crack expanded and the firebox was compromised. She knew he'd take the cheaper option, and a week later the replacement plate arrived on the supply wagon. She installed it herself. Cody offered to help and she let him, which meant she did the work while he held things and handed her tools and asked questions with the cheerful persistence of a golden retriever. "How do you know how to do all this?" he asked while she fitted the new plate. "I've had to," she said. "When you're the cook, you're responsible for the kitchen. The kitchen has a stove. The stove breaks. You either fix it or you don't cook." "The last cook didn't do any of this," Cody said. "Davies, He paused, apparently reconsidering something. "He left when things got hard." "Why?" Cody hesitated again. He had a problem with... He didn't like certain things about how the ranch operated. Said it wasn't what he signed up for. She tightened the plate fitting and looked at Cody. "What things?" Cody's face went through a brief, visible struggle. He was not a boy who lied easily. His face didn't have the musculature for it. "I don't know exactly," he said, which was almost certainly not true. She let it go. She finished the plate installation, tested the heat distribution, and determined it was significantly better than what they'd been working with. Small win, but real. At Raven Creek, real small wins accumulated into something you could stand on. The first time she saw the man from Helena, she didn't know that's what he was. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February, riding a horse that was too expensive for the road it had been on. She noticed the horse first, a black Morgan with clean lines and tack that was conspicuously well maintained, and then noticed the man on it, who was somewhere in his 50s, well-dressed for the frontier in the particular way of men who wanted to appear practical while signaling prosperity. He wore a long coat that was clean, which, at this point in a Montana winter, told her more about him than anything else. He tied the horse at the post near the main building and went inside. She watched from the kitchen window. 45 minutes later, through the same window, she saw him come back out. George Aldine was with him, standing on the porch, and the conversation they were having did not look comfortable. Aldine had his arms crossed, which she knew was not his relaxed posture. The man in the long coat was talking with the measured ease of someone accustomed to delivering terms rather than negotiating them. He handed Aldine something, an envelope, and touched his hat and went back to his horse. Aldine stood on the porch holding the envelope for a long time after the man rode out. She thought about going out and asking him what had happened. She thought about it and decided against it. If Aldine wanted her to know, he'd tell her. That was their arrangement, and it had worked well enough so far. She started supper. At the table that evening, the atmosphere was different. Harlan Butte, who normally kept his own counsel about the ranch's business dealings, was quieter than usual. Tightly quiet. The kind of quiet that was holding something in rather than having nothing to say. Swenson and a man named Reyes, who roomed together in the bunkhouse and had apparently already talked, exchanged glances twice during the meal. Cody, unusually, was not talking. Nathaniel Cross ate his supper. He ate it with the same focused attention as always, and he did not look at anyone in particular, but she noticed his jaw was set differently than normal. A small tightening that changed the line of his face. After the meal, as the men were leaving, Aldine stayed behind. He sat at the table while she cleared it and said, without preamble, "The man who came today was a representative of a company called Meridian Land and Cattle. They've submitted a formal offer for the water access rights on the east boundary." The third stream. she said. He looked at her with brief surprise, then remembered that she'd been listening at breakfast 8 weeks ago. The third stream, yes. If they acquire those rights, they can control the volume available to every ranch in the lower valley. It's not just about Raven Creek. Who makes the decision? She asked. Aldine picked up his coffee cup and found it was empty. He set it back down. That's complicated, he said. Complicated how? He looked at her steadily, then looked at the door. There are aspects of this ranch's ownership structure that are... He stopped. What I can tell you is that the decision is not mine to make, and the person who makes it understands the situation. She set down the plate she was holding. Nathaniel Cross, she said. Aldine's expression told her she was right, even before he said, What makes you say that? Because he's the only person on this property who doesn't behave like someone who takes orders, she said. He works with the crew, but he doesn't work for anyone. He stays at the table after meals and thinks. He doesn't ask Cody to hold things for him. He manages the physical space of this ranch the way someone manages what's theirs. She picked the plate back up. And because you look at him differently than you look at the other men. Aldine was quiet for a moment. Miss Hartwell, he said, I need you to... I'm not going to say anything to him, she said, or to anyone else. What I know or think I know is my own business. She paused. But I want you to understand something. I gave you my word I'd stay, and I meant it. That word was given to you and to these men and to this kitchen, not to any arrangement of ownership I was or wasn't aware of. So it stands regardless. Aldine looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. A slow, genuine nod, the kind that meant something. Thank you, he said. Finish your supper before you go, she said. You've been working in that cold all day. He finished his supper. She didn't change anything about how she treated Nathaniel Cross. She thought about it. She turned the question over in the quiet hours before dawn while the stove heated and the kitchen moved from cold to bearable, and she examined it from different angles. Should she be different with him now that she knew, or strongly suspected, what he was? Should she be more careful, more formal? Should she pull back the small domesticities she'd built into their evening interactions, the kept warm plate, the occasional exchange over the last of the coffee? She decided no. Whatever he was, whatever he owned, and whatever decisions were about to be made about water rights and company offers and the future of this valley, he was still the man who had walked into her kitchen during a blizzard and said, "Show me," and spent 3 hours helping her save the pipes. He was still the man who ate last and noticed the birthday cake and told her quietly that what she'd done for Pettit was a good thing. He was still the man who looked at her in the way she now understood was attention and not assessment, who saw her doing her work and registered not just the output, but the intention behind it. If he'd wanted her to know who he was, he would have told her. He hadn't told her. That was his choice, and she wasn't going to force an accounting of it by changing how she behaved. If the day came when the accounting was necessary, she'd have it then. In the meantime, she had a ranch to feed. The supper that Thursday was better than usual. She'd had a delivery come in with the supply wagon that included real butter, not the heavily salted preserved kind, and she'd used it in the biscuits and in a pan gravy over salt pork that made the entire cookhouse smell like something you'd travel to get to. Men who had been subdued all day by whatever they'd heard or sensed about the man from Helena came into the cookhouse and visibly changed when the smell hit them. She watched it happen, the particular physical relaxation of men walking into warmth and food after a hard, cold day, and she thought about what Aldine had said, that the kitchen was the reason 12 men got up every morning and went to work without complaining, and she decided he was probably more right about that than she'd initially credited. Nathaniel came in with the last group. He sat in his usual spot. She brought out the pan gravy and the biscuits and the stewed beans, and she moved around the table efficiently, and when she came to Nathaniel, she served him the same way she served everyone else, which is to say, properly, without performance in either direction. He looked at the food. He looked at her briefly. He said, "The kitchen smells good tonight." "Butter on the supply run," she said. "It won't last long, so I used it." He nodded. The most ordinary exchange in the world. She moved on to the next man. Later, when the table had cleared and she was doing the last of the work, Nathaniel was at the table again. He had a cup of coffee, and he was looking at nothing in particular, which was the look she'd come to understand meant he was working something out in his head. She gave him the space to work it out. After a while, he said, without looking at her, The man who came today. Did Aldine speak with you? She kept her hands moving on the work in front of her. Some. And? And I have the same arrangement with this ranch I had this morning, she said. I told him I'd be here, and I'm here. Nathaniel was quiet. You're not curious? He asked. She considered the question honestly. I'm curious about most things, she said. But I've learned that curiosity without the right moment is just impatience. The right moment will come for whatever needs to be understood. She paused. Is that something you found to be true? He looked at her then, fully, in the way he sometimes did. The kind of look that didn't slide off the surface of things. Yes, he said. I have. She nodded. She finished the dishes. He sat at the table until she blew out the lamp, and then he stood and put on his coat and went out into the dark without saying anything more. And she stood for a moment in the cooling kitchen and tried to identify what it was she was feeling. It wasn't romantic, exactly. Or if it was underneath something else. A deeper recognition, the kind that came not from attraction, but from the rarer experience of being genuinely understood by someone who had no obligation to understand you. She'd had kindness before, and she'd had patience before, and once, years ago in Billings, she'd had something she'd been willing to call love before it proved itself unequal to the actual demands of her life. She knew the difference between those things and this. This was different. She just didn't have a word for it yet. The second week of February brought another problem, unrelated to the company from Helena, which was the particular cruelty of ranch life in winter. Problems did not wait for other problems to resolve before arriving. This one came in the form of a sick cow that turned out to be 3 sick cows, which required veterinary intervention, which required a man to ride to Decker Hollow, which meant the crew was short during a period when the stock needed more attention than usual, which meant longer hours for everyone. Evelyn extended supper service by 2 hours and kept things warm. She also started sending noon meals out to the men, rather than expecting them to come in, which meant Cody was running back and forth across the property with a covered pot and a basket of bread, complaining about the cold in the cheerful way he complained about everything, meaning not really complaining at all. She packed the noon basket with more than they strictly needed because she knew from experience that men who were worried about sick animals and working past their normal capacity ate more than they thought they would, and running short at noon meant the afternoon went badly. On the third day of the sick cow situation, when she was in the middle of the afternoon bread baking, Harlan Butte came into the kitchen. Not at mealtime, not for coffee. He came in during working hours, still in his coat, and stood just inside the door with an expression that told her something had happened. What is it? She asked. One of the cows didn't make it, he said. Reyes's favorite one. He's in the barn, and He stopped. Harlan Butte was not a man who talked about feelings easily, which meant watching him try was genuinely uncomfortable. He's not doing great. She looked at him. What do you want me to do? I don't know, he said, with the honesty of a man who genuinely didn't. You always know what to do. I thought you might. I'll send food out, she said. The good stuff. And give him space. Don't make him talk about it. Harlan nodded, clearly relieved to have a directive. Yeah, okay. And Harlan, he looked back at her. Tell him you're sorry. Not about the cow. Just that you're sorry he's having a hard day. Don't explain it or expand on it. Just say it. He looked at her for a moment, slightly lost, slightly convinced. Okay, he said again, and went back out. She packed the afternoon basket with an extra portion and added a small jar of preserved plum she'd been holding back, and she sent it with Cody with instructions for Reyes specifically. She didn't send a message with it. The food was the message. That evening, Reyes sat at the table and ate his supper without speaking much. But near the end of the meal, he looked across at her and said, The plum was good, Miss Hartwell. There's more if you want it, she said. He shook his head, not declining, just registering that the offer existed. Thank you, he said. She nodded. She moved on. At the end of the table, Nathaniel Cross had watched this exchange. She didn't look at him, and he didn't say anything, but she felt his attention in the room the way she felt the warmth from the stove. Not dramatically, not intrusively, just present and steady and reliable. The week after that, the supply wagon brought mail. This was not unusual. Mail came with the supply wagon roughly every 2 weeks, sorted by Aldine and distributed after supper. Most of the men received nothing most of the time, which they handled with the particular frontier stoicism that was not indifferent so much as the long practice of not expecting. Cody sometimes received letters from his mother in Illinois. Pettit received them from Bozeman. Harlan Butte received nothing and acted as if he preferred it that way, which she suspected was not true. She received a letter herself that week, which surprised her. She hadn't given her address at Raven Creek to many people. There was her sister in Billings, who wrote occasionally, and there was a woman she'd cooked alongside at the hotel in Billings, a good solid woman named Clara Marsh, who kept up a correspondence because she believed people should know someone was thinking about them. This letter was from Clara. She read it in the kitchen after the supper service, by the lamp. Clara wrote the way she did everything, directly and without ornamentation. The letter covered the usual ground, the hotel, a new head cook who was apparently difficult, weather in Billings that was apparently bad, a neighbor's house fire that had been distressing. And then, near the end, I heard from Mrs. Paget that the situation with Brennan's, where you were before, is worse than when you left. He's gone through 2 cooks since October. Apparently he told the last one the same thing he told you, particular build. I thought you should know, because sometimes it helps to know these things weren't about you. They were about him, and they still are. Wherever you are now, I hope it's somewhere that sees you clear. She read that last sentence twice. Somewhere that sees you clear. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She stood at the counter for a moment with her hand flat on the folded paper, feeling its edges through the fabric. She heard a sound at the door. Not a knock, just the particular way the latch shifted when someone put weight on it without opening it. Then the latch released and Nathaniel Cross stepped in from the cold, stopping when he saw her standing at the counter in the lamplight. "I didn't know you were still up," he said. "I'm always still up," she said. He came in and went to the stove to warm his hands, which was a thing he did sometimes. Came in from late evening rounds or wherever he'd been, and stood at the stove for a few minutes before going to the bunkhouse. She'd gotten used to it. It was another of the small constants she'd built the evenings around, without exactly meaning to. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him pause. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. Then, because she was a person who had always found honesty marginally more manageable than performance, "I got a letter from a friend. It said something that landed." He waited. "She said she hoped I was somewhere that sees me clear," Evelyn said. "I'm trying to decide if that's true of this place." Nathaniel Cross looked at her from across the kitchen. The lamp threw unsteady light across the room, and outside the wind was doing something low and persistent against the building. And he looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she'd learned to read. Not sympathy, not pity, but the specific attention of someone who understood what was being said beneath the words. "It is," he said. 2 words, same as the first time. But they landed differently this time. Not as simple acknowledgement, but as something firmer. Something that had thought behind it. She nodded. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the folded letter, and she thought, maybe Clara is right. Maybe this is the place. She didn't say any of that. She said, "There's coffee if you want it." He poured a cup. She wiped down the counter. The lamp burned between them, and outside the wind kept going, and neither of them said anything else. And the silence was not uncomfortable, but it was weighted in a way that she thought, in the very back of her mind, she would probably remember for a long time. The letter from Clara stayed in Evelyn's apron pocket for 4 days. She didn't reread it. She didn't need to. She had the relevant sentence memorized after the first reading, the way you memorize things that struck a nerve before you were ready for them. Somewhere that sees you clear. She'd carried those words through breakfast services and noon meals and supper cleanups, through bread baking and pipe checks, and the particular early morning silence of a kitchen coming back to life from cold. And somewhere in the middle of all that carrying, she'd stopped asking whether it was true and started simply accepting that it might be. That acceptance made her uncomfortable in a way she didn't entirely trust. She had learned, over 34 years of being a woman in the kinds of places she'd worked, that comfort was a thing to be examined before it was embraced. Comfort could mean safety. It could also mean you'd stopped paying attention. The two felt similar from the inside, and the difference only became clear when something disturbed the surface and you discovered whether you'd been resting or going soft. So she paid attention harder. She watched the ranch in February the way she'd watched it in January, but with different eyes now. Eyes that knew more of the architecture beneath the surface, The ownership question hovering over everything, the company from Helena and their envelope, and the water rights and Nathaniel Cross sitting in the middle of the table eating what was left. She watched all of it, and she kept cooking, and she kept waiting for whatever was coming to arrive at a speed she could actually respond to. The third week of February, it started arriving faster. Two men came from Decker Hollow on a Monday morning, riding together on horses that had been pushed harder than the road warranted. They asked for Aldine at the main building and got him, and the three of them went inside and the door closed. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window for the same reason she always watched from the kitchen window. Not because watching was her business, but because understanding the environment she was cooking in had always been her business, and those were not separate things. The men left after an hour. Aldine came to the kitchen at noon, which was unusual on a Monday. He didn't sit down this time. He stood at the door, coat still on, and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to keep it in the kitchen." "Everything I hear in this kitchen stays in this kitchen," she said. He nodded. Meridian Land and Cattle has filed a claim dispute with the Territorial Land Office. They're contesting the water access rights on the east boundary, the third stream, on the grounds that the original grant documentation is incomplete. She set down what she was holding. "Is it?" "The documentation exists," Aldine said carefully. "Whether it's complete depends on who's reading it and what they're being paid to find." "How long do these things take?" "Months. Sometimes longer. They're counting on time being a pressure." He paused. "They're also counting on this ranch not having the resources to mount a sustained legal response." "And does it?" Aldine looked at her. The look was one she'd seen before in the faces of people managing something larger than they were comfortable admitting. "That's being addressed," he said. She thought of Nathaniel's voice, people withstanding to address it. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Aldine seemed surprised by the question, then seemed to settle into it. "The men are going to hear about this. Cody already heard from the riders. You know how that boy is. By supper, it'll be at the table. I need them to feel like the ground is still under them, like there's still something here worth the work they're doing." She looked at him for a moment. "You're asking me to cook a good supper." "I'm asking you to do what you do," he said, "which is more than cooking supper, and you know it." She did know it. She'd known it for years, but had rarely heard it named so directly by someone who wasn't her. "I'll handle the table," she said. "You handle the legal situation." He put his hat back on and went out. She turned back to the kitchen and stood for a moment taking stock of what she had and what she could do with it, not just materially, but strategically. She had real butter still, from the last supply run. She had dried apples she'd been holding back. She had the skills and the instincts and the 12 years of feeding people through difficult things. And she had the particular knowledge of these 12 men, their soft spots and their pride and their specific fears, that she'd built one meal at a time over 10 weeks. She started cooking like it mattered, because it did. Cody, as predicted, had told everyone by supper. He hadn't meant to cause anxiety. He never meant to cause anything except conversation. But the news traveled through the crew during the afternoon hours, and by the time the men sat down that evening, the table had a different quality to it. Not panic. These were working men in a hard country, and panic was a luxury they'd trained themselves out of. But there was a tightness in the way shoulders sat, in the shorter sentence lengths, in the way Harlan Butte was not filling the silences he normally filled. She brought out the food. The dried apple pie had taken her the better part of the afternoon. Proper pastry, reduced apple filling with the last of the cinnamon, latticed top, because she'd decided that if she was going to make the effort, she was going to make the actual effort. The main course was a slow-braised beef, which she'd started before she even spoke to Aldine because she'd seen the riders arrive and understood that the day was going to need something substantial to end it. The bread was fresh, the coffee was strong. She watched the table's mood shift when the food came out. It was not magic. It was not a cure for the specific anxiety of men whose livelihoods were being threatened by people with lawyers and money. But it was real, and it was warm, and it said, without words, that someone had thought about them that afternoon. Someone had stood in a kitchen and decided they were worth the effort of the good version rather than the expedient version. Petit was the one who said it. He always seemed to be the one. He looked at the pie in the middle of the table and said quietly, "She made pie." Nobody responded to that directly, but the table changed. Shoulders dropped a half inch. Swenson poured his coffee without looking at it, which was what he did when he was relaxed. Reyes passed the bread to Harlan without being asked, which was a gesture so small it would have meant nothing a month ago and now meant everything. Nathaniel Cross looked at the pie and then at her. She was at the stove, not watching, or appearing not to watch. But she caught his look in her peripheral vision, and she registered it the same way she registered everything about him these days, carefully, without making it into something it might not be. He ate with the same focused attention as always. He ate last, as always. When she brought his plate to the warm spot she kept for him, he said, "You made pie today." "I had the apples," she said, "in the middle of everything else you had today." She paused, looked at him directly. "In the middle of everything else, people still need to eat, and sometimes they need to feel like someone worked for them specifically." She paused. "That's not separate from everything else. It's part of it." He held her gaze for a moment, then, "I know." She went back to the kitchen, but something in that exchange stayed with her all through the cleanup. Not the words, which were simple enough, but the weight of "I know." The certainty of it. He hadn't said "I understand" or "that makes sense," or any of the soft approximations people used when they were following along but not quite landing. He'd said "I know," as if he'd been watching her feed people through difficult things for longer than 10 weeks, as if he understood what it cost and what it built and why it mattered. She thought about that, and then she put it aside because she had a kitchen to close and tomorrow's bread to start, and 12 men who needed breakfast in the morning, regardless of what Meridian Land and Cattle was filing in the Territorial Land Office. She went to Decker Hollow on a Thursday. This was not unusual. She made the trip roughly every 3 weeks, to send supply correspondence and to pick up any personal mail, and occasionally just to have an hour in a place that wasn't Raven Creek, because even a cook who loved her kitchen understood that a kitchen you couldn't leave was a cell rather than a workspace. Aldine had arranged a ride with the supply wagon driver, a taciturn man named Burke, who communicated primarily in short declarative sentences and was therefore excellent company for the 20-minute ride. Decker Hollow was not much of a town. A general store, a post office, a land office, a small hotel that also served as a saloon, and a collection of houses that had accumulated rather than been planned. It sat in the valley below the ranch properties and served as the administrative and social center for everything within a 20-mile radius, which meant it punched significantly above its weight in terms of information and rumor and the kind of low-level legal activity that shaped life in the territory. She sent her letter at the post office, picked up the supply correspondence, and walked to the general store for a small list of personal items: thread, a new thimble to replace the one she'd lost in December, writing paper. She was at the counter paying when she heard 2 men talking near the back of the store. She was not trying to listen. But the store was small, and voices carried, and one of the men said the word Raven Creek clearly enough that her attention sharpened without her making a decision about it. "Cross isn't going to fight it," the first man said. I was someone she didn't recognize, somewhere in his 40s, with the specific look of a man who spent time in offices rather than outdoors. That's what Whitmore thinks. The documentation dispute will drag it out long enough that the operating costs become unsustainable. "Whitmore doesn't know Cross," the second man said. He was older, roughly her age, and had the look of someone who'd been in the valley for a long time. He's not the kind to... Whitmore knows what the land office has on file and what it doesn't. That's the whole point. It doesn't matter what kind Cross is. It matters what's on the paper. She paid for her items without looking at the men. She said thank you to the store clerk. She walked out. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the store for a moment with her purchases in her arms and the cold air pressing in from all sides, and she made a decision. She walked to the land office. The land office was a single room with a front desk, and behind it, shelves of flat files and rolled documents organized in a system she didn't immediately understand. A young man at the desk looked up when she came in. "I'd like to see the ownership map for the North Valley properties," she said. The young man blinked. "Are you a property holder in the area?" "I'm employed by one," she said. "I'm not disputing anything. I'd just like to see the general map." He seemed uncertain but not actively resistant. The map was, apparently, a matter of public record. He found it after a few minutes of searching and spread it on the front desk for her to look at. She looked at it. The valley was laid out in clean surveyor lines, property boundaries, watercourses, access notations. She found Raven Creek Ranch easily enough, identified its borders, traced the east boundary to the stream, marked as the third water source. She read the access notation beside it. Then she read the name attached to the property itself. She already knew what the name would be. She'd been mostly certain for weeks. But there was a difference between mostly certain and seeing it written by a surveyor's hand on an official map, notated cleanly in ink, as simple and settled as any fact could be. Nathaniel A. Cross, owner of record. She looked at it for a moment. The land, the cattle, the buildings, the water rights being contested, everything she'd been cooking in and cooking for, owned by the quiet man at the middle of the table who ate last and said, "Show me during a blizzard," and had never, in 10 weeks, given her any reason to treat him differently than she treated any working man who came to her table hungry. She thanked the young man. She folded the map notation in her memory and walked out. She sat on the supply wagon bench next to Burke on the ride back and looked at the valley passing on either side of the road. The white fields, the frozen creek beds, the fence lines marking the boundaries of things people had built and were now being required to defend. Burke said 3 sentences in 20 minutes, none of which required a response. She was glad of that. She was still working out what she felt. It wasn't betrayal exactly. Betrayal required an explicit promise broken, and Nathaniel had made no explicit promises. He'd simply not told her who he was, and in the absence of a question directly asked, not telling was not the same as lying. She knew this. She believed it intellectually. But there was something underneath the intellectual position that was less tidy, a feeling she recognized from years of being misjudged before she opened her mouth, which was the feeling of having been tested without knowing you were being tested, and not being entirely certain whether passing the test was something to be proud of or something to be angry about. By the time the wagon rolled through the Raven Creek gate, she'd decided the answer was probably both. She didn't confront him that night. She thought about it during the supper service while she moved around the table with the food and the coffee and the particular invisible efficiency she'd developed that meant she could manage 12 people's needs simultaneously while appearing to manage nothing at all. She thought, I could say it tonight. I could say it simply. I went to the land office today. I saw the map. I know. That's all it would take. She didn't say it. Not because she was afraid of the conversation. She'd had difficult conversations her whole life, and they'd never broken her. But because she wanted to be certain of her own position before she opened that door. She wanted to know not just what she felt about the information, but what she intended to do with it. Because once she said she knew, the dynamic changed, and she wasn't ready for all of the things that might change along with it. She served Nathaniel his supper the same way she always did. He said thank you the same way he always did. The table had its usual rhythm, slightly more subdued than before the news about the land dispute, but recovering. She could feel the recovery happening in real time as the food worked on the mood, the way food always worked on mood, not by eliminating the problem, but by restoring the body's capacity to face it. Afterward, she closed the kitchen, and she lay awake for a long time in the narrow bed in her small room off the main kitchen building, and she thought about everything she knew and everything she still didn't, and she decided to wait. Not indefinitely, but for the right moment. The way she'd told Nathaniel, curiosity without the right moment was just impatience. The right moment announced itself 9 days later, on a Wednesday, in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had gone to town again, not on the regular schedule, but because the supply of salt had run dangerously low, and she'd made the case to Aldine that this was not a situation that could wait for the regular wagon. She rode in with a hand named Fletcher, who was heading to town anyway for harness parts, and she planned to be back before noon. She got her salt. She was at the post office picking up the accumulated mail when she saw Nathaniel Cross walking out of the land office on the other side of the street. He hadn't seen her. He was walking with a man she didn't recognize, someone in a coat similar to the one worn by the representative from Meridian who'd come to the ranch 3 weeks ago, the same conspicuous cleanliness, the same bearing that suggested accustomed authority. They stopped on the sidewalk outside the land office and spoke for a moment. The unknown man handed Nathaniel a document. Nathaniel looked at it. He did not look pleased, and he did not look panicked. He looked like a man reading something he'd expected and still didn't like. He said something. The other man shook his head. Nathaniel said something else. The other man shook his head again, and then he walked away toward the hotel, and Nathaniel stood on the sidewalk with the document in his hand and looked at it for another moment. Then he looked up and across the street and directly at her. The distance between them was maybe 40 feet. He saw her see him. There was a moment, brief, suspended, the kind of moment that established a before and after, in which they both stood with the full weight of what they each knew and what they each knew the other knew, and nobody moved. Then he crossed the street. He stopped in front of her on the sidewalk. He was holding the document at his side. His face was doing the contained thing it did when he was working something out and hadn't finished working it out yet. But there was something else in it now that she hadn't seen before. A crack in the container, something pressing through. "You saw," he said. It wasn't a question. She'd been seeing, and he was a precise man. "I did," she said. He looked down at the document in his hand. He looked back at her. "How long have you known?" 9 days, she said. "I went to the land office in March on personal business, and I saw the ownership map." "And you didn't say anything?" "I was waiting for the right moment." He looked at her steadily. Something in his face shifted, the crack in the container widening, just slightly, before he seemed to become aware of it and pulled it back. Not entirely, but enough to function. "Are you angry?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, the way she always considered honest questions. "I was," she said, "for a few days. Then I stopped being angry and started being, I don't know, unsettled. The way you feel when something you thought was one shape turns out to be a different shape." "It was the same shape," he said. "What I am here is what I showed you. I work, I eat, I help when I can. None of that changed. I know that." Then I know it intellectually," she said, keeping her voice level because they were standing on a public street and she had no intention of giving anyone in Decker Hollow an interesting story. "But knowing something intellectually and feeling at ease with it aren't always the same thing. I'm sure you know that too." He was quiet. "Why?" she asked. She'd been carrying the question for 9 days, and it came out not with accusation, but with the simple weight of something held too long. "Why not tell people?" He looked at the document in his hand rather than at her, and for a moment she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because when people know what I own, they stop seeing me. They see the land. They see the cattle and the money and the leverage. They start being careful in ways that have nothing to do with who I actually am." He paused. "I've had men work for me for years who never once said an honest thing to my face because they were afraid of the consequence. I've had people tell me my worst ideas were brilliant because they needed the wage." He stopped again. "I got tired of it. I wanted to be in a place where people talk to me like a person. And Aldine knows. Aldine has worked with me for 6 years. He agreed to maintain the," he gestured with the document, "arrangement. And Cody? Cody knows I'm not a regular hand. He doesn't know the specifics. He's 19 and has the discretion of a weather vane." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "What about me?" she asked. "Was I being tested?" He looked at her directly. "No," he said. "Not in the way you mean. I wasn't watching to see if you'd behave differently. I just—" He stopped, started again. "I watched you because you were worth watching. You treated every man at that table with the same attention. You stayed up half the night in a blizzard to keep the pipes from bursting for people you'd known 3 weeks. You remembered a man's birthday and made something to market when there was no requirement for you to do any of that." He stopped. "I wasn't testing you. I was paying attention to someone who was doing something genuinely worth paying attention to." She stood on the cold sidewalk in Decker Hollow and held that. Let it sit in her rather than immediately categorizing it or deflecting it or finding the careful response. Then she said, "This document." She nodded at what he was holding. "Is it bad?" He looked down at it. "It's a formal notification that the contest of the water rights access has moved to the next level of territorial review. It means a longer timeline and a more complicated legal process." He paused. "But it's also the moment where I stop letting them believe this ranch is an easy target." "What does that mean practically?" "It means I hire a territorial attorney who is very good at reading original land grant documents. And it means I stop letting people assume they're dealing with a foreman who doesn't have resources to fight back." He folded the document and put it in his coat pocket. "It's going to get more difficult before it gets easier. There'll be more men like the one you just saw me talking to. More pressure, more paperwork, more people showing up on ranch property who have no business being there." She nodded. She was filing this information, understanding its implications. I'll need to explain myself to the crew, he said, properly, about who I am and why I kept it the way I did. They deserve that. Yes, she said. They do. I'd rather do it at the table, he said, in the kitchen, if that's... It's your kitchen, she said, without meaning it as a rebuke and hearing, as she said it, that it landed slightly like one anyway. He looked at her. I mean that factually, she said. It's your property. It's your kitchen, he said back, with the particular steadiness of a man who had thought about the distinction and decided where he stood on it. What happens in that room is yours. I'm asking if it's all right with you. She looked at him for a moment, at his face, which was doing none of the things people's faces did when they were managing her. No condescension under the courtesy, no calculation, no performance of respect designed to get something. He was just asking a question and waiting for an actual answer. Tonight after supper, she said, I'll make sure everyone stays. He nodded. Thank you. She went back to find Fletcher and her salt, and she sat on the wagon bench on the way back to Raven Creek and watched the valley move past and thought about all the ways the next few hours were going to change the shape of everything at Raven Creek Ranch, and tried to decide how she felt about that. She decided she felt like someone standing at the edge of known territory, looking at what was past the line. Not afraid exactly, but aware, in a way that demanded her full attention, that what was coming would require the same thing from her that everything here had required, showing up completely, without retreat, and trusting that the work she'd been doing for 10 weeks had built something solid enough to hold weight. She had supper ready at 7, the same as every night. She'd gone back and forth all afternoon about whether to make the meal different, more elaborate, something that signaled the gravity of the evening. She'd decided against it. The gravity was there regardless. What the men needed was normalcy alongside it, the reassurance that some things were not changing, that the floor beneath them was still the floor they'd been standing on. She made a good, honest supper. Nothing extraordinary. Everything solid. The men came in. They ate. She watched Nathaniel at the middle of the table. He ate with his usual focus, but he was sitting differently, with a quality she recognized from the moments before difficult things happened, the particular stillness of a person preparing to speak. When the plates were mostly cleared, he set his fork down. He didn't stand. He stayed seated, which she thought was the right instinct. Standing would have made it a speech, and this was not a speech. He looked around the table at the men he'd been eating with, working alongside, for years in some cases and months in others, and he said, I need to tell you something I should have told you before. The table went quiet in the way it went quiet when something real was happening. Harlan Butte stopped moving. Cody, impossibly, stopped talking. Swenson looked up from his coffee. Pettit set his cup down. Reyes looked at Nathaniel with the steady attention of a man who had suspected something for a while. My name is Nathaniel Cross, he said, and I own this ranch. The silence after that was a particular kind, not shocked exactly, because some of them had suspected and some of them had half known for longer than they'd acknowledged. But the naming of it changed things in a way that suspicion didn't. It made it real. Harlan looked at the table, then looked at Nathaniel. How long? He said. 7 years, Nathaniel said. I've owned it 7 years and worked it the same way for 5 of those. Before you ask why, I wanted to know what the work actually was. I wanted to be in it, not managing it from outside. He paused. I know that's not a straightforward explanation for why I let you believe something else. I'm not offering it as one. I'm just telling you the truth of it. Cody said, So George, Aldine is the foreman. That part is real. He runs the daily operations. Nathaniel looked at Cody. Everything you were told about how the ranch works is accurate. It's just that I'm the one who owns the ground it works on. Cody sat with this. It moved visibly across his face in stages. What's happening with Meridian? Harlan said. He was always going to be the one to get to the operational question fastest. It was, she'd come to understand, one of his better qualities. Meridian Land and Cattle is contesting the water access rights on the east boundary, Nathaniel said. They filed with the Territorial Land Office. Today they moved to the next level of review. It's going to take time, and it's going to take a legal response, and I'm going to provide that response. He looked around the table. This ranch is not going to be taken apart by a company that moves on properties by making the legal process expensive enough to exhaust them. I have resources they don't know about, and I intend to use them. Why tell us now? Reyes asked. He had the particular directness of a man who asked the question other people were thinking but hadn't shaped yet. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Because it's coming into the open whether I manage it or not," he said. "And because you're the people this affects directly. You deserve to know what you're working for and who you're working for, and those two things shouldn't be a mystery." He paused. "I should have told you before. I didn't. I can't fix that, but I can give you the truth now and let you do what you want with it." Reyes nodded. A slow, considering nod. Harlan said, "Does it change the work?" Nathaniel looked at him. "No." "Does it change the pay?" "No." "Does it change who's in charge of the cattle operations day to day?" "No." Harlan picked his coffee cup back up. "Then I don't see why it has to change much." It was the most practical thing anyone had said, and it was very specifically Harlan Butte, cutting through what was difficult to get to what was actionable, which was, she had come to understand, how he processed almost everything. The table shifted again, slightly, the way it had shifted when the pie came out. A collective recalibration toward whatever came next. Not without discomfort. Swenson looked like a man chewing on something that didn't quite go down smooth. Pettit was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was thinking, rather than when he was sad. Cody had approximately 11 questions visibly forming behind his eyes, and was, for once, managing not to say all of them at once. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter and watched it all, and then she began clearing plates because that was her work. And the work did not pause for recalibrations. She was at the sink when Nathaniel came to stand beside her. Not dramatically, not with announcement. He simply walked over to where she was working, and he said quietly, so only she could hear, "Thank you for tonight. I made supper," she said. "You know that's not what I mean." She looked at him sideways. "I know," she said. "You're welcome." He stood there for a moment with the uncomfortable certainty of a man who had more to say and hadn't yet decided whether to say it. She kept her hands moving on the dishes. The water was cold because it always got cold quickly in the kitchen sink in February, and she was used to that by now, the same way she was used to most things about this place. "When I went to the land office in January," he said, "before you arrived, I saw you listed on the employment papers Aldine had filed, your name and your background. I knew before you got here that you'd cooked in mining camps and hotel kitchens, and that you'd left your last position under circumstances that weren't your fault." He paused. "I made a point of being in the kitchen that first morning to see what kind of person you were." She was still. Her hands had stopped in the water. "And?" she said. "And you walked past Harlan with a coffee pot and told him he was standing in your kitchen," he said. "And I thought, this one is going to be all right." She turned and looked at him fully. He was looking back at her with the expression she'd learned over 10 weeks. The one that was attention without agenda, presence without performance. And she saw in it something she hadn't been looking for and couldn't now pretend she hadn't found. The simple, unguarded fact of a man who had been paying attention to her from the beginning, not to assess her worth, but because he had already decided she was worth the attention. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "The dishes aren't going to do themselves." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something that was the precursor to a smile, in a face that didn't go there often. "No," he said. "They're not." He picked up a dish towel from the rack beside the sink. He started drying what she washed. They worked in silence at the sink while behind them the table noise continued. Cody had apparently decided this was the moment to ask all 11 of his questions simultaneously, and Harlan was fielding them with a patience that suggested he found Cody more tolerable than he'd ever admitted. And the kitchen held them all in the warm, unremarkable way it had been holding them all winter. She washed. He dried. The lamp burned. She thought, "This is a different shape than anything I knew how to expect," and she let herself, very carefully, very quietly, begin to adjust to it. The morning after Nathaniel told the crew the truth, the ranch felt different in the way a room felt different after a window had been opened. Same room, same furniture, same walls, but the air moving through it had changed. Evelyn noticed it in the small things first. Cody, who normally came into breakfast talking, came in quiet. Not the bad kind of quiet, the thinking kind, which was rarer for him and therefore more interesting to observe. Swenson sat down and poured his coffee and looked at the table for a moment before he drank it, the way a man looked at something he was seeing with adjusted eyes. Harlan Butte came in third, same as always, and nodded at her at the door, same as always. But there was something underneath the nod that hadn't been there before, a quality she didn't have an immediate word for, something between respect and relief. Reyes came in last among the early group and stopped at the counter before sitting down. He said, "Miss Hartwell, you knew." It wasn't an accusation. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, as a statement that was also a question. "For about 9 days," she said. He considered this. "And you didn't tell anyone." "It wasn't mine to tell." He nodded once, the particular nod of a man who respected a principle even if the principle had been inconvenient. Then he sat down and had his breakfast and said nothing more about it. Nathaniel came in with the last group, same as always. He sat in the middle of the table, same as always. He ate what was brought to him. But something about the quality of his presence at the table was different. Not louder, not more prominent, but more settled, the way a person settled when they were no longer carrying a thing they'd been carrying for a long time. She noticed that the other men glanced at him differently. Not deferentially exactly, not with the particular watchfulness of men measuring a new authority. More like men who'd revised a map they'd been navigating and were finding the actual landscape matched the revision reasonably well. The morning moved forward as mornings did, regardless of what had happened the night before. 3 days after the table conversation, a lawyer arrived from Helena. His name was Emmett Dre, and he was not what Evelyn had expected from a territorial attorney, which was probably her own fault for having expectations. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had the particular blankness of someone who had learned that showing nothing was a professional advantage. He wore his coat the way men wore uniforms, not with pride exactly, but with the automatic correctness of someone who had dressed for a function rather than for comfort. He came in the supply wagon with a document case that was heavier than it looked, and he went directly into the main building with Nathaniel and Aldine and didn't come out for 4 hours. At noon, Evelyn sent food in. She did this practically. She'd fed men through long meetings before, had learned from experience that the quality of decisions made in hour 4 of an empty stomach discussion was notably worse than those made in hour 4 of a fed one. She sent Cody with a tray and told him to knock, leave the food, and come back without trying to overhear anything, which instruction Cody received with the expression of someone being asked not to breathe. He came back. Nathaniel looked tired, he reported. "Thank you, Cody," she said. "Dishes." At supper, Nathaniel was at his usual place, but Dre joined the table. This was novel. The table had been 12 men for the entire winter, 12 known quantities, and the addition of a 13th changed the social geometry in ways that were slightly uncomfortable. Men who had found their particular rhythms of conversation and silence had to recalculate. Dre ate efficiently and with minimal ceremony. He did not seem to notice, or perhaps to care, about the social recalibration his presence had triggered. He was not rude. He thanked her for the food with the mechanical courtesy of someone whose mother had trained it into him. But he was also not present in the way the other men were present. He was somewhere else in his head, working through something, and the supper table was an interruption he was tolerating. She watched him with the evaluative attention she brought to any new variable in her kitchen. After supper, when most of the men had gone, Dre stayed at the table with Nathaniel and spread papers across the cleared surface. Aldine joined them. Evelyn cleaned around them, working at the sink and the stove, while the 3 men talked in the focused, technical shorthand of people working through a specific problem. She was not trying to listen, but the kitchen was one room, and she was in it. "The original access grant is solid," Dre said. He had a dry, precise voice, the kind that rarely rose or fell for emphasis. Dated 1871, filed correctly with the territorial office. Meridian's contest rests on a notation in the secondary survey from 1873 that their arguing superseded the original access provision. He tapped a document. "The notation doesn't say that, but it's ambiguous enough that they have grounds to force a review." "How long does a review take?" Nathaniel asked. "If they push it to the full territorial board, 4 months minimum. More likely 6. And in that 6 months? In that 6 months, technically the access status is in question. They'll use that uncertainty to approach the other properties in the valley whose operations depend on downstream water flow. The argument being that an uncertain access right is effectively no access right, and they'll offer to resolve the uncertainty by acquiring it. Aldine said, "That's the whole play. Manufacture the uncertainty and then sell the resolution." "It's a clean strategy," Dre said, without admiration and without condemnation, just assessment. "The question is whether we let them set the timeline." "What's the alternative?" Nathaniel asked. "We file for expedited review on the grounds that the ongoing uncertainty is causing measurable operational harm. That moves the timeline significantly, but it requires documentation of the harm, actual numbers, not hypothetical ones. And it requires someone at the territorial board level who is willing to take the expedited docket." "Do you have someone?" Dre looked at him. "I have a relationship with the board secretary. Whether that relationship translates to docket priority depends on whether the documentation is compelling." He paused. "The harm calculation is what matters. If we can show that the uncertainty is genuinely damaging operations, not just inconveniencing them, we have grounds." Evelyn put down the pot she was holding. She said, without turning around, "The other ranches." The three men at the table looked at her. She turned. "You said Meridian is going to approach the other properties in the valley, the ones whose operations depend on downstream water." She looked at Dre. "If they're doing that, if the other ranches are already feeling the uncertainty, isn't the harm already happening, not just to this ranch, but across the valley?" Dre looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "It would be," he said, "if we had documentation from those operations corroborating the impact. Then someone needs to talk to those ranches," she said. "Get them to document it. Letters, statements, whatever form is acceptable. If Meridian's strategy is to isolate each property and pick them off one at a time, the response is to stop being isolated." The table was quiet for a moment. Aldine looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. He had the expression he sometimes wore when she said something he'd been thinking and hadn't yet said. Not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of recognition. "She's right," he said. Dre looked down at his papers, then back at the table. "Coordinated affidavits from multiple affected properties would substantially strengthen an expedited review filing," he said slowly. "The challenge is organizing that kind of coordinated response in a short time frame. These ranchers don't know each other well. They have their own concerns, and asking them to put their names on a document that puts them in opposition to a Helena company is a significant request." "Someone would have to go to them," Nathaniel said. "Someone who knows the valley," Aldine said, "and who people will actually open a door to." Another silence. She turned back to the sink. "I go to Decker Hollow every 3 weeks," she said. "I know Burke, who drives the supply wagon. Burke knows every property in the valley because he supplies half of them." She paused. "I'm not saying I'm the right person. I'm saying it could be organized around existing movements." She heard Nathaniel's chair shift. She did not look at him. "Would you be willing?" he asked. She considered it for a moment. Not the answer. She had already decided the answer while she was forming the sentence. But the honesty of what she was agreeing to, which was more than a supply run and more than a conversation. It was inserting herself into a legal and political situation that was not her fight and not her land, and doing so at the request of a man whose land it was and whose situation she had feelings about that she hadn't entirely sorted out yet. "I'd need to know exactly what you're asking people to sign before I ask them to sign it," she said. "And I'd need it in plain language, not legal language. People don't put their names on things they can't read plainly." Dre said, "I can produce a plain language affidavit." "And I'd go as myself," she said, "not as a representative of this ranch, as someone who has seen what's happening and is asking neighbors to stand together." She paused. "That's a different ask than a legal document from Raven Creek's attorney, and it'll get a different response." Dre looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathaniel. "She understands negotiation," he said, in a tone that was almost admiring and somewhat surprised. "Yes," Nathaniel said quietly. "She does." The conversation with the Valley Ranches did not happen immediately, and it did not happen cleanly. Burke, when she explained what she needed, looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man being asked to do something outside his usual scope. Then he said, "Meridian's been offering the Hallett operation a water arrangement for 2 months. Hallett hasn't signed yet, but he's not comfortable." He paused. "And the Swede up on the North Fork is worried. His well runs shallow in summer. He needs that third stream." Would they talk? She asked. To you? Maybe. Burke considered. You've been in the valley all winter. You're not a lawyer, you're not from Helena, and you make decent food. That counts for something out here. She wasn't sure whether to be amused or resigned by that assessment. She settled for neither and took it as practical information. They went on a Saturday, 3 weeks before the expedited review filing deadline Dre had identified. Burke drove. She sat beside him with Dre's plain language affidavit in her coat pocket, which she'd read 4 times and revised twice in consultation with Dre, removing language that sounded more like a trap than an invitation, and replacing it with sentences that said simply, "This is what is being done to the valley, and this is what we are asking you to confirm you have witnessed." The Hallett operation was first. Jonas Hallett was a man in his 60s who had been ranching in the valley for 20 years and had the particular stubbornness of someone who had survived that long in a hard country by being skeptical of things that sounded too easy. He met them at the gate, not at the house. "I heard Cross was behind this," he said, looking at Evelyn and then at Burke, not yet at the document. "Nathaniel Cross is one of the people who'll be filing with the territorial board," she said. "The filing is about the water access, which affects every operation in this valley, not just his. Meridian isn't going to stop at Raven Creek if they get what they want there." Hallett squinted. "What exactly are you asking me to sign?" She handed him the document. He read it slowly, the way men who'd been burned by documents before read them, line by line, looking for the place where the plain language turned complicated. He read it twice. "This says I've observed Meridian representatives approaching my operation with water rights offers," he said. "Has Meridian approached your operation with water rights offers?" "Yes." "Then that's what the document says, and it's accurate." He looked at it for another moment. He looked at her. "You cooked for Brennan's Hotel in Billings before you came here." She blinked. "Yes. My wife's cousin worked there, says you were the best cook they had and Brennan let you go because he was a fool." He folded the document. "I'll sign it." That was not how she'd expected the morning to go, but she had learned long ago that the reasons people ultimately did things were not always the reasons you'd anticipated, and the right response was not to question them, but to accept the outcome and move forward. The Swede on the North Fork, his name was Lars Anderson, and he was a large man in his 50s who communicated in a combination of English and something else that was approximately Swedish, but had been road-worn into something harder to categorize, was more complicated. He didn't distrust Evelyn. He distrusted documents, which he explained at some length. She sat at his kitchen table for 45 minutes. She drank the coffee his wife offered, which was very strong and not entirely finished cooking when it was served, and she talked about the water situation in practical terms. Not legal terms, not strategic terms, but the basic functional reality that if Meridian controlled water access to the valley, the Anderson operation would be buying from them at whatever price they set in whatever drought year they chose to use as leverage. She did not exaggerate. She did not make promises about outcomes. She said, "This is the situation. This is what one rancher is doing about it, and this is how your name on this paper helps." He signed. His wife signed a second copy that Evelyn hadn't planned to have, but that Dre had included on the theory that additional signatures from adjacent property holders would not hurt. She came back to Raven Creek that evening with 3 signed affidavits: the Hallett operation, the Anderson farm, and a smaller ranch southeast of Decker Hollow, whose owner, a woman named Martha Breen who ran the place alone and had been waiting for someone to give her a specific action rather than a general concern, had signed in under 5 minutes and offered to contact 2 other properties directly. She handed the affidavits to Dre at the kitchen table. He looked at them with the controlled interest of a man who did not usually show enthusiasm. 3 in one day, he said. 4, possibly. Martha Breen said she'd contact the Overland outfit. Dre looked at Nathaniel. "That's enough for a compelling harm filing if we get one more," he said. Nathaniel was looking at Evelyn, not with the expression she might have expected from an employer whose strategy had just been advanced, with something quieter and more specific than that. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it. She'd been in wagons and at strange kitchen tables for 6 hours, had a conversation about water law with a man who communicated in 2 languages simultaneously, and had drunk coffee that was still determining whether to be liquid. "I'm tired," she said honestly, "but it was a good day." He nodded. She went to the stove to check what needed doing for supper, because supper needed doing regardless of what else the day had been. Dre filed the expedited review request the following week. The ranch settled into a particular kind of waiting, the kind that had enough work in it to prevent pure anxiety, but not enough resolution to allow genuine rest. Evelyn cooked through it the way she cooked through everything, which was with complete attention to the immediate task and a disciplined refusal to cook with whatever emotion was currently complicating the air around her. March had come in by then, and with March came the first suggestions of something other than absolute winter. Not warmth exactly. Not yet, but a slight softening at the edges of the cold, the particular quality of late afternoon light that didn't feel like it was apologizing for existing. The men responded to it in different ways. Cody became more energetic, which was hard to imagine but demonstrably occurred. Swenson became slightly less aggrieved. Harlan Butte started a project in the barn that seemed to involve a lot of hammering and no explanation, which Evelyn understood as his version of optimism. Nathaniel was in the kitchen one morning when she came in before dawn. This had never happened before. She came in before 4:30 most mornings, and she had always had the kitchen to herself for that first hour, which she valued not for solitude exactly, but for the particular kind of thinking that was only available when you were working alone in a quiet room. She stopped in his doorway when she saw him. He was at the table, not the stove, sitting with a cup of something, a ledger open in front of him, reading by the single lamp he'd lit. He looked up when she came in. "I'm sorry," he said. "I couldn't sleep. I should have—" "It's fine," she said, and came in and went to the stove because it was fine, or would be. She built the fire up and set the first pot of water on and moved into her morning routine with the slight adjustment required by the presence of another person in the room, which was not significant. She'd cooked in kitchens with other people before. The rhythm was adaptable. For a while, neither of them said anything. She worked. He read the ledger. The stove heated the room from cold to bearable. The expedited review was accepted, he said. She looked over her shoulder. I was looking at the ledger, not at her. When? Dre sent word yesterday evening. I got the message after supper. He paused. It means a hearing before the territorial board in approximately 6 weeks. The affidavits will be submitted as part of the filing. That's good news, she said. Yes. He turned a page in the ledger. It means Meridian will know they've misjudged the situation. There'll be a response. More pressure on the properties that signed the affidavits, possibly on people who helped organize it. She turned around fully. He was looking at her now. On me, she said. Possibly. I don't know what form it would take, but you should know it's a possibility. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Jonas Hallett and his wife's cousin, and the way he'd folded the document and said he'd sign it. She thought about Lars Anderson and his not-quite-finished coffee and the particular way he'd looked at the paper before putting his name on it. Not reluctantly, but deliberately, with the weight of a man who understood what a name on paper meant. She thought about Martha Breen signing in under 5 minutes because she'd been waiting for something specific to do. Those people signed documents with their real names, she said. I'm not going to be more careful about my involvement than they were about theirs. Nathaniel held her gaze. The lamp was still the only light, and it was still before dawn, and the kitchen was caught between cold and warm, and he looked at her with the expression that was becoming, she thought, one of the things she would carry from this winter regardless of how everything else resolved. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to be. I just wanted you to know what you'd agreed to. I know what I agreed to, she said. I read the document 4 times before I asked anyone else to sign it. His mouth moved. The almost smile, same as the night they'd dried dishes together. Yes, he said, Ed. You would have. She turned back to the stove. The water was close to boiling. She measured the oats and found herself in the odd position of wanting to say something else and not being certain what it was, which was unusual for her. She generally knew what she wanted to say. After a moment she said, Why did you really not tell anyone? He was quiet. She heard the ledger close. I told you, he said. People change when they know. You told me that part. She didn't turn around. I'm asking about the other part. The part that made you choose to live this way for 5 years instead of just managing the ranch from the outside like most owners would. A long silence. The water reached its boil. My father owned land, he said finally. A lot of it. He managed it from offices in Billings and then in St. Paul. He knew the numbers and the maps and the legal descriptions, and he didn't know a single person who worked any of it. Not their names, not their situations, not what they were good at or what they were struggling with. He paused. He was not a cruel man. He wasn't indifferent in the way people who want to be indifferent are indifferent. He just never thought to be otherwise. The land was an asset. The people on it were operational components. Another pause. I inherited this property when I was 29, and I decided the first thing I was going to do was understand what I owned, not the acreage, the actual thing. She poured the oats into the boiling water and adjusted the heat. She did not say anything. It became not a method exactly, he said, more like something I couldn't undo. After the first winter of actually doing the work, I couldn't go back to managing from outside. It would have been like trying to read a map of a place you'd walked through. The map is useful, but it's not the place. She turned around. He was looking at the closed ledger, not at her. That's a fair reason, she said. He looked up. You're not angry anymore. She thought about it. No, she said. I think I was angry about the shape of it, that I hadn't known. But the reason is fair. And the thing itself, she stopped, found the rest of it. The thing itself was honest. The work was real. What I watched you do for 5 months was real. It was, he said. I know it was. She held his gaze. That's what I'm saying. I'm not accepting it on faith. I watched you do the work and it was real, and that's its own kind of evidence. He looked at her with the open, unguarded expression that she'd seen only rarely. The one that was not managing anything, not containing anything, just simply present. Evelyn, he said. Nobody at Raven Creek called her Evelyn. They called her Miss Hartwell, or Cook, or occasionally nothing at all. She'd given no one permission to call her anything different, but he said it as if it were the most natural word in any sentence, without performance, without asking whether it was all right, and she found that she did not need him to ask. There are things I want to say to you, he said, and I'm going to say them badly because I don't say them often and I haven't practiced. Say them anyway, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when you came here, I was watching to see what kind of person you were. I said that. What I didn't say is that I stopped watching after about a week because it stopped being observation and started being something else. He looked at his hands. You're the most capable person I've met in a long time. Not capable the way people say it when they mean competent. Capable the way it means. You understand what things are actually for. The kitchen isn't a room to you. It's a function, a community, an act of attention. The food isn't sustenance. It's something you do for people specifically, with their specific needs in your head. He stopped. I've been trying to do that with this ranch for 5 years, and I'm not as good at it as you are at it in a kitchen. She stood at the stove with the oats going and the dawn starting to pale the windows, and she let him finish. I don't know what you feel, he said, and I'm not asking you to tell me now. I'm telling you what I feel so that you have the information, and you can do with it what seems right to you, and I'll still be here regardless. She looked at him for a long moment. I know what I feel, she said. I've known for a while. I've been being careful about it because careful was what the situation required. She paused. The situation's changed. He looked at her. It's early yet, she said, in most of the ways that matter. Yes, he said, and there's a legal hearing in 6 weeks and a ranch to run and 12 men to feed. Also, yes. And I still don't entirely know what I'm doing about any of this, she said. The whole situation, what it means for what comes next, where I fit in it. I know, he said. I'm not asking for an answer to any of that. Not today. She nodded. She stirred the oats. The kitchen was warm now, properly warm, the way it got by the time the fire had been going for 30 minutes, and outside the light was beginning to be real, rather than just the absence of dark. I'm going to make biscuits, she said. You can stay if you want. He stayed. The pressure Nathaniel had predicted came in the form of a man who showed up at the ranch on a Tuesday in the middle of March and asked specifically for Evelyn Hartwell. She was told this by Cody, who had answered the main door and come to the kitchen with the specific expression of someone carrying information he knew was significant but wasn't sure how to convey. There's a man from Meridian, he said. He says he needs to speak to you. She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the main building. The Meridian representative was not the same man who'd come in January. This one was younger, somewhere in his mid-30s. and had the particular look of someone who worked with paper and leverage rather than land or animals. He was standing in the main room with his hat in his hands, which she recognized as a deliberate posture. The hat in hand stance said, "I am not a threat, and I am not here to argue," and it was frequently used by people who were both. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "my name is Arthur Voss. I work for Meridian Land and Cattle." "I know who you work for," she said. He was briefly surprised and then unsurprised. "Then you know why I'm here." "I have a general sense," she said. "Say what you came to say." He looked around the room, checking for other people. She understood. There were none. Aldine was in the barn and Nathaniel was on the east fence line, and the hands were at various points across the property. "The affidavit you organized," Voss said. "The ranchers in the valley, Hallett, Anderson, the Breen woman. You brought them together." "They brought themselves," she said. "I provided the document." "The document that is currently being used to expedite a territorial board review of our client's rightful claim. Of your client's contested claim," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at her. He was good at looking calm, but she'd spent 5 months at a table with 12 men learning what calm looked like from the inside versus the outside, and Voss's calm was the outside kind. "You are a cook," he said. Not cruelly, just as a statement of what he believed was relevant. "Employed seasonally by this ranch. The legal matters that this ranch is engaged in are, I went to neighbors and asked them to put their names on a factual account of what had happened to their operations," she said. "That's not a legal act. That's a neighborly one." She held his gaze. "Is there something specific you came to ask me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Meridian is prepared to offer the ranches in this valley a water access arrangement that would be favorable to all parties. The territorial review complicates that arrangement. If the affidavits were withdrawn, they won't be," she said. "I haven't finished explaining. You don't need to." She looked at him steadily. "Those people signed their names because they understood what was happening in this valley, and they chose to say so formally. You can't offer them something that makes that choice worth undoing, because what they chose wasn't a negotiating position. It was a statement of what they'd witnessed." She paused. "And they can't withdraw what they actually witnessed. The withdrawal of the document wouldn't change the reality it described." Voss looked at her. It was a different look than the one he'd come in with. She'd replaced the assumption he'd been operating on with something he hadn't expected to encounter, and she could see the recalibration happening behind his careful expression. "Meridian will not forget the role you played in this filing," he said. The words were controlled, but the intent behind them was not. She looked at him without expression. "I expect they won't," she said. "Anything else?" He put his hat on. He left. She stood in the main room for a moment after she heard the horse leave the yard, and she breathed steadily and let herself feel the particular kind of shakiness that followed confrontations she'd been holding herself rigid through. Her hands were fine, her voice had been fine, but her heart rate was doing something she'd have preferred it not to do, and her legs were not as steady as they'd been 10 minutes ago. She went back to the kitchen. Nathaniel was there when she arrived. She didn't know when he'd come in from the fence line or whether he'd seen the Meridian horse in the yard. He was standing at the counter with his coat still on, and he looked at her when she came in. She said, "Your predictions were accurate." "What did he want?" "To ask me to facilitate the withdrawal of the affidavits. I told him that wasn't possible." She went to the stove and picked up what she'd been working on before Cody's interruption. "He said Meridian wouldn't forget my involvement." Nathaniel was quiet. "That's a threat," he said. "I know it's a threat." She kept her hands moving. "It's not the first threat I've received. In various forms, in various situations, across 34 years. None of the previous ones landed." She paused. "What I need to know is whether it changes anything legally, whether his visit has implications for the hearing." He crossed the kitchen in the 4 steps it took to cross the kitchen, and he was beside her at the counter, not touching her, just present in the way he was present, close enough that she was entirely aware of him. "It doesn't change the legal situation," he said quietly. "But I need you to know that if it creates any consequence for you, any actual consequence, not just a threat, I will address it, fully, with every resource I have." She looked at him sideways. "I know you will," she said. "I'm not worried about that." "Then why do your hands look like that?" She looked down at her hands. They were gripping the spoon more tightly than the oatmeal required. She released her grip, adjusted. "Adrenaline," she said honestly. "It takes a few minutes to clear." He was quiet beside her for a moment. Then, very carefully, he set his hand over hers where it rested on the counter. Not holding it, just set his hand there, warm and still. She did not move. She breathed. After a moment, the shakiness cleared. She turned her hand over briefly and pressed his palm, and then she went back to the cooking, and he went to take off his coat and pour himself a cup of coffee. And the kitchen returned to being what it was, warm, functional, honest, with the understanding between them sitting in it as a thing that had been named and was now simply present. The same way the stove was present and the lamp was present and the winter was still present outside the walls, doing what it had always done. While inside something had changed in a way that was going to take time to understand, but that was real in the particular way only things you didn't plan for were ever completely real. The territorial board hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in early April, which meant the last 2 weeks of March passed at Raven Creek, in the particular suspended quality of time before something important, neither fast nor slow, but weighted with the awareness of what was coming. Evelyn cooked through it. She cooked through Dre's second visit, when he spread revised documents across the kitchen table and walked Nathaniel through the hearing procedure in the dry, precise voice of a man who found comfort in process. She cooked through the arrival of 2 more affidavits, the overland outfit that Martha Breen had contacted, and a small sheep operation north of Anderson's that had apparently been watching the situation and decided to add its name without being asked. She cooked through the morning. Nathaniel rode out before dawn and didn't return until after dark. And through the evening, Aldine came in looking older than he had in January and ate his supper without saying much. She cooked because the cooking was real and immediate, and because 12 men needed to eat regardless of what the territorial board decided, and because she had learned, over 34 years of being underestimated in rooms she'd had every right to be in, that the most reliable thing she could offer any situation was her full, undiminished presence, not a diminished version of herself waiting for the outcome. Herself, completely, doing the work. The night before Nathaniel left for Helena, he came to the kitchen after the other men had gone. She was finishing the bread for the following morning. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee. He didn't drink and watched her work in the way he sometimes watched her work, not absently, but with the specific attention she'd grown accustomed to and stopped being unsettled by. It was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. "If it goes wrong tomorrow," he said. "It won't," she said. "But if it does, Nathaniel." She turned around and looked at him directly, the way she looked at men who needed to hear something plainly. "You have 5 affidavits from Valley ranchers. You have an attorney who knows the original documentation is solid. You have an expedited review that was granted because the board accepted the premise of your argument." She paused. "If it goes wrong despite all of that, we deal with what comes next. But I'm not going to help you catastrophize the night before a hearing." He looked at her for a moment, then, "You're right." "I usually am," she said. "You're getting better at recognizing it." That pulled the almost smile. Fuller this time, closer to the real thing. She turned back to the bread. "Will you be here when I get back?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. It was a simple question and a complicated one simultaneously. Logistically simple, weighted in every other way. "Yes," she said. "I'll be here." She heard him set the coffee cup down and stand. She heard him cross the kitchen. She heard him stop behind her, close enough that she was aware of him, the way you were aware of warmth from a stove without turning to look at it. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. The affidavits, the Valley ranchers, the kitchen, Pettit's birthday." He paused. "For treating me like a person before you knew I owned anything." She set the dough aside and turned around. I was close. Not uncomfortably close, but close in the way 2 people stood when they'd stopped pretending they were further apart than they were. "You were easy to treat that way," she said. "You made it simple." He looked at her. She looked back. And then he did something that was not dramatic or cinematic, but was honest in the particular way honest things were. He put his hand against her face, briefly, carefully, the way you touch something you were not certain you were allowed to touch. She leaned into it, slightly, for just a moment. Then he said goodnight, and he went out, and she stood in the kitchen with her hand on the bread dough and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. And she thought, all right then. He came back on a Friday evening. She knew before he came through the door. She knew from the way Cody erupted from the bunkhouse and the sound of voices in the yard. Not the careful, muted voices of men waiting for bad news, but the louder, somewhat disorganized voices of men who'd been carrying tension and were now releasing it. She was at the stove. She did not go to the window. She waited. He came through the kitchen door 10 minutes later. He was travel-worn. 2 days on the road showed on him in the particular way travel showed on people who didn't complain about it, which was everywhere except their face. His face was... She read it in the half-second before he said anything. The board upheld the original access grant, he said. The 1871 documentation was ruled sufficient. Meridian's contest was dismissed. She breathed. She hadn't known she'd been holding her breath, but she had been, for approximately 2 weeks. All right, she said. The affidavits were cited in the ruling, he said. The board noted coordinated evidence from multiple affected properties as supporting the expedited review decision. He looked at her. Dre said he'd never seen a plain language filing generate that kind of response. He wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on future cases. She blinked. He wants the cook to consult on legal strategy. He wants the person who turned Valley Ranchers into a coordinated filing in a single Saturday to consult on how you do that, Nathaniel said. I told him I couldn't speak for you. She turned back to the stove. She was processing multiple things simultaneously, which was something she was good at. The ruling, Dre's request. Nathaniel standing in her kitchen after 2 days on the road with travel dust on his coat, and the look on his face that she'd come to understand as his version of relief, which was quiet and internal and only visible to someone who'd been paying attention for 5 months. Supper in 30 minutes, she said. Evelyn. She turned. I don't know how to say this correctly, he said, so I'm going to say it plainly and you can correct me if I've misjudged it. He stayed where he was, near the door, not moving toward her, giving her the room to respond honestly. I want you to stay. Not through spring. Not until the next position comes along. I want you to stay because this ranch is better with you in it, and because the kitchen you've built here is not something that gets rebuilt easily, and because... He stopped, found the rest of it. Because I would like the opportunity to know you for longer than one winter, if that's something you want. She looked at him. She thought about the letter from Clara. Somewhere that sees you clear. She thought about Hallett signing the affidavit because his wife's cousin had told him she was worth it. She thought about Pettit and his photograph in his shirt pocket, and Harlan Butte standing in her kitchen at 5 in the morning saying the beans were good. She thought about 12 men who had come through a hard winter and been held, in part, by the fact that someone had decided their birthdays and their bad days and their preferred amounts of salt mattered. She thought about what it cost to build that and how rarely you found a place that understood what you'd built. I'm not staying because you own the ranch, she said. I know. And I'm not staying because the alternative is going back to Billings and starting over somewhere that doesn't see me. I know that too. I'm staying because this place has become something, she said, and because I want to see what it becomes next. She paused. And because you dry dishes without being asked, and that turns out to matter more than anyone would think. He looked at her for a moment with the open, unguarded expression that she'd come to understand was his version of everything he couldn't say. Then he nodded, once, simply. Then you'll stay, he said. I'll stay, she said. Spring came to Raven Creek, the way spring came to Montana. Slowly and then suddenly, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first, and the ice breaking on the creek, with a sound like something finally letting go. The mud season was difficult in the practical ways mud seasons always were, and Evelyn navigated it with the same thoroughness she'd navigated everything else, adjusting supply orders, managing the particular challenge of feeding men who came in with their boots carrying half the yard, adapting the menu to what was fresh and what wasn't yet. The ranch hands, one by one, made their individual peace with the winter's revelations. Harlan Butte, in his particular fashion, made his peace through action. He finished the project in the barn, which turned out to be a set of shelves he'd built for the cookhouse storage room without being asked or announcing the intention. She came in one morning to find them installed, solid and level, holding 3 times what the previous arrangement had. He was gone before she could say anything. She reorganized the pantry to fit the new shelves, and didn't mention it to him directly because she understood by now that Harlan's language was action, and the correct response to an action was another action, which in this case was a doubled portion of the molasses cake she made the following Sunday. He ate it without comment. She considered them even. Cody, whose 11 questions from the night of Nathaniel's revelation had apparently reproduced into approximately 40, spent several weeks asking them one at a time until he'd worked through most of what confused him. He asked Nathaniel some of them directly, which she observed with the particular pleasure of watching someone young enough to still believe in the basic availability of adults learn that the belief was sometimes warranted. Nathaniel answered him honestly, without impatience, in the same measured way he did everything. Pettit went home to Bozeman for 2 weeks in April when the worst of the mud dried. He came back with a photograph of his children that was newer than the one he kept in his shirt pocket, and he showed it to her without ceremony, setting it on the counter while she was working and saying, "They got taller." She looked at it properly, at the 2 small faces that had survived a winter in their father's pocket. She said they looked like him. He said that was probably a problem for them, and she laughed, and he put the photograph away and finished his coffee. Swenson's knee got better in the warmth. Not entirely, not dramatically. It was still a knee that had been through something, but he stopped sitting at the angle and stopped having the delay when he stood. She noticed this and did not mention it, because Swenson was a man for whom being noticed was more uncomfortable than most difficulties, and the best thing she could do for him was to register his improvement privately and proceed. Martha Breen came to Raven Creek on a Tuesday in May with a small jar of preserved peaches and the information that the Overland Outfit's owner had said, in her hearing, that the filing they'd been part of was the first time he'd felt like a neighbor rather than a competitor in 15 years of valley ranching. She relayed this with the satisfaction of someone reporting evidence for a proposition she'd already believed. She stayed for coffee and a conversation about the territorial board process that was, Evelyn thought, the most technically informed conversation she'd had with another woman in years. After Martha left, Evelyn stood at the kitchen door and looked at the valley in the late May light. The grass coming up green where the snow had been, the creek running clear and fast with the melt, the fence lines marking what people had built and what they were defending and what they intended to keep. It was not a grand landscape in the way some Montana country was grand. It was a working landscape, marked by use and care and the particular beauty of land that had someone paying attention to it. She thought about what she'd told Nathaniel in the kitchen that first cold morning. When you cook for someone, you're not just cooking. You're responsible for how they feel when they leave that table, whether they feel seen or invisible. She'd been talking about food, but she understood now that she'd been talking about everything. The affidavits, Pettit's birthday, the pipes in the blizzard, Martha Breen and the Overland Outfit and Jonas Hallett and Lars Anderson putting their names on paper because someone had bothered to show up and ask. The work of keeping people from feeling invisible was not a kitchen-specific skill. It was just a skill. And the people who had it and chose to use it changed the temperature of whatever room they walked into. She had spent 34 years in rooms that didn't want to see her clearly. She had cooked in places that valued her output and dismissed her personhood, had worked for men who saw her ability and flinched at her body, had built kitchens in places that had no intention of being built into. She'd done it anyway. Not because she had no other choice, but because she understood, in the way only people who'd been underestimated their whole lives understood, that the work was real regardless of whether the people around you were ready to say so. What Raven Creek had given her was not a revelation about her own worth. She'd known her worth. It had given her something rarer, a place that knew it too. On the first warm Saturday of June, Nathaniel found her in the kitchen garden she'd started in April. A practical arrangement of vegetables in the ground behind the cookhouse, not ornamental, just functional, the kind of garden that would feed people through next winter if it was tended properly. She was on her knees in the dirt, which was not a graceful position and which she did not try to make graceful, because the dirt needed working and grace was beside the point. He crouched down beside her without being asked and started on the next row. He was not good at it. He was a man who knew cattle and fence lines and water rights, not root vegetables and soil composition, and she let him do it incorrectly twice before she said, "Angle the tool more. You're pulling too shallow." He adjusted. Better. They worked in silence for a while, the way they'd learned to work in silence, which wasn't empty silence, but the kind that had companionship in it, the kind that 2 people arrived at after enough time in the same spaces doing the same difficult things. "Dre sent a letter," he said. "Meridian has withdrawn from the valley." She looked up. "Fully?" They've sold their holdings in the territorial district. The letter says they've moved their focus to properties in the Eastern Territories. He paused. Which means they're doing to someone else what they tried to do here. But they're not doing it here. She sat back on her heels. She thought about that. The partial victory of it. The thing that was won and the thing that wasn't. Meridian hadn't changed what they were. They just redirected it. That was not a clean ending. Life in a working landscape rarely produced clean endings. It produced outcomes you could stand on and work from, which was different. We should write to the Eastern Territorial Land Offices, she said. Tell them what Meridian does and how it works. Give them the documentation. She looked at him. Someone out there is going to need to know what they're dealing with before Meridian shows up on their boundary. He looked at her. The look lasted long enough to say something without saying it. Yes, he said. We should. We. She heard that. She let herself hear it. She went back to the garden. He went back to the row he was working, with the corrected angle, doing it better than before. The sun was making a real effort for the first time since October, and the ground was warm under her hands, and behind them the cookhouse stood solid and real against the mountain air. There are things you can only understand after you've been through a long winter and come out the other side with the same people you went in with. You understand that strength is not what you look like at the starting line. It is what you're still doing at the end of the difficult thing. You understand that being seen clearly is not the same as being seen completely. It means someone is looking at what you actually are, not what they expected when you walked through the door. And you understand that belonging is not a place you find already built. It is something you make, one meal at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one winter of showing up completely at a time. Until one morning you look around at the room you've been building and realize it holds you back just as well as you've been holding it. Evelyn Hartwell had come to Raven Creek Ranch with an old recipe book and 34 years of being judged before she opened her mouth. She stayed because she'd found something she'd been cooking toward her whole life without knowing it had a name. And the man working the row beside her, the man who had eaten last for 5 months, who had dried dishes without being asked, who had said, "Show me in a blizzard," and meant it, kept working the soil with the corrected angle, in the direction she'd pointed him, doing it better than before. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. Not glamorous, not perfect, not finished. Just two people in a garden, doing the work, on the first warm day